The tension between the Connecticut Assembly's planning, development and housing committees with local zoning has been largely fomented by developer-funded nonprofits such as the Partnership for Strong Communities, Desegregate CT, and the Open Communities Alliance. That tension has been largely counterproductive. Zachery Conine, Nevada's state treasurer, makes that point as part of a much bigger presentation highlighting how Nevada is creatively financing and incentivizing housing development in the state. Connecticut Senate Majority Leader, Bob Duff, may finally get at that fighting local zoning is a loser strategy.
We found that the locals are the better vehicles to lean in on things like zoning and make sure that the zoning practices which they're dealing with every day from mechanically, as opposed to just sort of the conceptual way we deal with it, to make sure that those are happening.
You touched upon a little bit about local zoning and how that, especially since you have county government, and how that works with your infrastructure bank and even building more housing. But how well or not, or what's the tension, I guess, between what you're trying to do and local government or county government as it relates to building housing or zoning resistance?
Thanks for the question, Senator. I'm trying to figure out the nice way to say this. We generally do not spend a ton of time thinking about zoning because the size of the hole is so big. And so we direct capital to places where zoning isn't an issue. And so there are certain communities that are more willing to allow for infill housing. They get more of the money. They get more of the attention. And when we're working in communities that have less of an interest in that front, we encourage them to realize that the reason why they haven't necessarily gotten as much money as other communities have had is because the zoning is an issue. I'll say that broadly, with the exception of some NIMBYism, which is bound to happen literally anywhere, we don't have that much of a problem on getting the local governments to be in line. They recognize the problem is as significant as we recognize the problem is. They are focused in the same way. They generally are oriented in the same direction. But we do think there's a value in the state or any other sort of capital allocation partner saying, hey, these are our values, and we're going to move those capital dollars around as befitting of the folks who share those values. And so we've seen ideas and plans for either restrictions at the legislative level that say, if you want access to this pool of money, here are the things you need to do. You need to have a fast lane for affordable housing construction. You need to reduce connection fees on sewer and water, or various other things that can be barriers to affordable housing. We support those sorts of efforts broadly. But as of today, there has been enough need that we haven't found ourselves sort of in a tiff with the local governments on zoning.
I would say that it's a little different here in Connecticut with regards to local zoning and the tensions that are faced. And I think Connecticut is a bit at a crossroads right now as to whether or not we continue kind of beating our head against the wall on working with some of the smaller communities, or we just invest in other communities that want to grow and thrive and build more housing and have more housing, because if it's easier to build it there, then maybe that's what we do.
Here is Nevada Treasurer Zachery Conine's complete presentation and conversation with the Majority Leaders Roundtable on Housing on January 29, 2024.
All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to convene our January 29th meeting of the Majority Leader Roundtable. Thanks, everybody, for joining us live here in this balmy room. And if you're on Zoom, hopefully you're in a cooler place than we are, because the climate control is not working as we would prefer it worked in the room right now. But we are going to survive this because we are durable people.
We want to feel like it's Nevada.
That's right. Coming from Nevada, who sent us heat here into the room, we do have a guest speaker today, the Nevada State Treasurer, Zach Conine, who's going to give us some perspective about what's going on in Nevada and the State Treasurer's office there to help advance this question of housing development and housing policy. So I'll allow our staff here. I just got a bio on Mr. Conine. He has a BA from Cornell and a law degree from UNLV's William S. Boyd School of Law, first elected treasurer in 2018. In addition to overseeing Nevada's and many municipalities' investments, he's also responsible for Nevada's college saving plan, numerous scholarships, helping Nevada citizens attend post-secondary schools, Nevada has had 2 bond increases, the first since bond rating increases, presumably, since 2006, and he likes to hang out with Senator Duff as a member of the New Deal leaders. So we want to thank Mr. Conine for being with us here today, and we'll have the staff admit him on the Zoom so that he can begin his presentation.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks to my co-chair, the majority leader, Rojas. Just also wanted to thank the treasurer from Nevada for being here today. Thanks to our staff for the coordination, and of course, New Deal for bringing us together back in November when he spoke to the group about his housing initiatives, which have been important. So we think this will be an informative discussion. We appreciate him being here, and as soon as we can get him on screen, we will get started. So good morning, Zach.
Good morning. Can you hear me all right?
I think so, yeah. Let's see,
Excellent.
It is,
Well,
what,
good
7
to
o'clock,
hear your
7
voice
o'clock
again.
in the morning there, so thanks for joining us bright and early.
Yes, and I'm actually with your treasurer here in Chicago for the day. So not balmy here at all, alas. But it is lovely back in the great state of Nevada, which you should all visit as frequently as you'd like to. But thank you, Senator. Thank you, Representative, for having me here today to talk a little bit about some of the work that Nevada is doing in the realm of affordable housing. I wanted to give just a brief landscape of where
Treasurer
we are.
Conine, can you hold on 1 second? Yeah, please continue. Go ahead.
Excellent. So I wanted to give just a brief overview about some of the work that we're doing in Nevada, starting a little bit with the size of the problem. In Nevada, like in almost all other places in the country, we have an affordable housing crisis. There are about 3.2 million people that live in the state. We are the 7th largest state from geographic size, and we find ourselves needing about 105,000 units in affordable housing. That's a problem, and not a problem that we're going to solve quickly, not a problem we're going to solve with anything less than an all-hands-on-deck approach. Of those 105 units, about 85,000 of these units would be what we consider big A affordable, right? So a need for a unit that has a 60% AMI restriction or less. We need 20,000 units in supportive housing, which is much, much harder to fund, and happy to chat about that if anyone has any questions. And our approach comes originally from a place of sort of moral compass, right? In Nevada, we believe housing is a human right. And if we can't solve housing, especially in a place like Nevada, which doesn't have an income tax, just in case you have any businesses out there listening, thinking about where they could be that don't have income taxes, just an idea. But in a state like that, we need to make sure that people are able to spend money in order to support the government and the services that they need, right? Our major revenue sources are sales tax, gaming taxes, other taxes and fees, but things based on consumption. And as we found at the beginning of the pandemic, when individuals are housing insecure, they are certainly budget insecure, and they're less likely to spend money, which of course then creates a ripple effect throughout the government. So the crisis is pretty existential for us. So coming from a place of housing as a human right, our focus primarily is on supply, not demand. Demand, we found, isn't something that the government's does a great job of preventing or encouraging on the housing front. And so we don't really spend a lot of time thinking about it. We focus on supply. And our broad belief is that all housing is good housing. There's a lot of arguments to say, we should focus just on affordable housing or just on transitionary housing or just on supportive housing or on support for individuals who are displaced from housing. We agree. But all housing is effective. If we're able to build a mansion, we know that that is going to help get someone in that mansion, which will then open up lower opportunity. We saw the reverse of that happen in Reno a couple of years back when Tesla moved into town with a gigafactory, right? Massive, great economic opportunity for the state, but it created a lot of displacement. So the individuals who were in $1 million homes found those $1 million homes too expensive and moved into $750,000 homes and sort of all the way down the housing chain until individuals who were found themselves in apartments ended up staying in weeklies and motels. And then the people who were in weeklies got displaced onto the street. When there is more demand, which you can't control, it just ends up compressing supply at all levels. And so our focus is on anything we can do to help from a level perspective. As Nevada's chief investment officer, as most treasurers have, I found myself in strange conversations about strange things when we see risk in front of us, and housing was one of those areas. During the pandemic, our work was to make sure that people were able to stay in their homes and stay safe. And so we worked with a lot of banks to help prevent foreclosures. And there's some work that can be done there, I think, in every state, just making sure that the local banks and the folks who are servicing mortgages at the Connecticut level are actually talking to policymakers. Most of those are national players, but you might find that there are levers that you can lever on the state level. But our biggest focus has been on funding and how do we make sure that we have enough money for affordable housing. We've done a couple of things here that I think are worthy of talking about. And of course, Senator and Representative, happy to take questions on literally anything. Our first was the use of ARPA dollars. So we dedicated $500 million worth of ARPA dollars, state and local fiscal relief, so the most flexible dollars, into an initiative called Home Means Nevada. And what Home Means Nevada did was it took the existing pipeline of affordable housing that was coming into the state through our housing division, housing that would typically be interested in LIHTC or other tax credits, right, that we were using conduit issuance, private activity bonds from the feds and for HUD in order to support. It was able to take that and supercharge it. So we were able to take projects that perhaps would be 2 or 3 years out and move them into the current, right, to increase that size of the pipeline. The other thing it helped us to do was fight the inflationary pressures that we all saw coming out of the pandemic, that we all see coming out of the pandemic, so that when those projects got more expensive, they still penciled and still got done. That $500 million will support around 4,200 units of housing, which isn't a great bang for the buck, frankly, but there are a lot of housing that wouldn't have happened but for that. And again, getting back to our original principle of all housing is good housing, we wanted to make sure those projects got done. Another area where we've been really effective is we have taken our entire allocation of private activity bonds, and a vast majority of that goes towards housing, whether it's through multifamily housing, through private activity bonds, or if we're using those bonds to support single-family down payment assistance, which we found is really helpful, especially in our more rural communities and places where housing and single-family homes still remain somewhat affordable. It's a great way to get people in homes, especially first-time home buyers. But on the multifamily side, we've really leaned away from industrial revenue bonds and using those for industrial purposes and really focused on housing. I think we have other tools that can help attract businesses to the state, but we don't have a lot of other tools that can help on housing. Since I've been treasurer, we've spent a little bit more than $2 billion on private activity bonds that have gone into multifamily housing, and that's been helpful. Those are all tools, of course, that Connecticut has available to them, and I'm sure you already use relatively effectively. Let's talk about some that are a bit unique to Nevada. In 2017, the state created something called an infrastructure bank with the original intention of providing a gap in funding between when our legislature meets. Our legislature only meets for 120 days every 2 years, and the work that needs to be done in the time that's outside of that legislative session. We found ourselves with budget opportunities that we just couldn't take advantage of. And so we created an infrastructure bank. We never funded it, as is the nature sometimes with government, but we had this vehicle. In 2021, we revisited that vehicle and really shifted it to focus on social infrastructure. So now we can spend money from that bank on housing. We can spend money from that bank on education, charter schools, and various other things. And part of that was a belief that there was capital on the sidelines that we could tap into, because at least in Nevada, there was not going to be enough money locally to deal with housing prices. We had to bring in invested capital from outside the state. And so we started talking to our friends, primarily in the union pension space, but in other major asset allocators, about what type of investments they were looking for. Now, if you remember at the time, the Fed hadn't increased interest rates nearly as high as they have now. So there were plenty of dollars that were supposed to go into fixed income that were effectively dormant, sitting on the sidelines, waiting to be invested. And a lot of them were moving internationally. You saw infrastructure investment in Australia, saw infrastructure investment in South America, in Spain, but not a lot in the United States, and certainly not a lot in Nevada. So in the creation of this bank, we worked with those private equity companies, with those union pension firms, with those other fixed income investors, to see what sort of infrastructure projects they were looking for. And we uncovered, it felt revolutionary in Nevada, but probably won't be news to everybody in the room. We uncovered the ability for us to invest in what became a virtuous circle. So by investing in a project that would hire union labor, we were able to then get the unions to join us, their pensions to join us. And those pensions then would be paying for a project, which would be hiring individuals who were union members and signatory contractors who would then pay back into the pension. And so what we found was that the pensions were willing to take a rate of return slightly less than the rate of return that the market would bear generally. And so that allowed us to build more. It also allowed us to attract a massive amount of capital. So in the infrastructure bank, we've dedicated $20 million, which is not a lot of money, into affordable housing. But that $20 billion, million with an M, million dollars is being matched by about $200 million from the AFL-CIO's Housing Investment Trust, which is a mutual fund made of experts that's been around since the 60s that does a ton of affordable housing and workforce housing and market rate housing all around the country. So by creating that vehicle, we've been able to bring in a lot of outside capital. In addition to outside capital, it also brought in outside developers. And at least in Nevada, we found that the affordable housing developers were all very good. There just weren't that many of them, right? And affordable housing is the sort of thing that the first time you build it is pretty hard. The second time gets a lot easier, right? It's just difficult to get through the mechanics and the bureaucracy. I'm sure there's no bureaucracy in Connecticut. We have a fair amount in Nevada. But to get through that bureaucracy in order to make it effective. And so by bringing in new developers, we actually found that we were able to drive the price down on the existing developers in the space just because they hadn't had any real competition in a decade or two. And so those new developers then expanded, right? If each developer could do 2 or 3 affordable housing projects, 250 units a piece in a calendar year, every new developer brought in another 750 units on an annual basis, as long as we could figure out a way to fund it. And so that's been some of the work that we've done in Nevada, and it's shown some results, right? We've created about 14,000 units from the sum total of all of those efforts. Of course, that doesn't, like most problems, if you pour water into the top of the bucket, but there's holes in the bottom of the bucket, it doesn't solve it. And so the next thing to think about is preserving affordable housing. Affordable housing generally is restricted. So when the housing became affordable originally, those rents were controlled. After a certain amount of time, 30 years on the outside, 15 years on the short side, that property can return to market rate unless it is reacquired and goes back into the big A affordable housing system, which is not necessarily hard to do, but is something that you have to be really intentional about. And in Nevada, we found there was no good database for projects that were affordable that had happened anywhere beyond about 5 years ago. And so by creating that database and figuring out when those properties would be able to potentially go back to market rate, we were able to work with those owners and those developers and say, hey, do you want to keep it affordable? We can help work you through the process and make sure that project can stay affordable in perpetuity. And so every unit we're able to save from moving back into market rate is just as good from a broader structure as a unit that we were able to create in the first place. So those are some of the things that Nevada's doing. Senator, Representative, happy to take questions on anything or dive deeper into anything, but I figured you all had better things to do than listen to me talk all day. I will say, just as a requirement, as a constitutional prerogative, being from the state of Nevada, I am supposed to say that it is Nevada, not Nevada. The senator's heard me say that a few times. I will continue in my quixotic quest to make sure that the rest of the country sorts that out. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Treasurer Conine. Does anybody have questions for Nevada's treasurer? Either on the Zoom, which I can pull up, or in the room. Now, Treasurer Conine, what I would ask, I guess, is really thinking about, we know we have a lot of conversations about access to capital and capital stacks and trying to identify every financial resource that we can find to put towards accomplishing these goals. Can you, and maybe turn up your volume on your end too? It might be that you turned down your volume when I asked you the question about echo. But if you can expound a little bit about how the treasurer has used any of your resources to kind of, I know you went into it, if you could dig a little bit deeper on opportunities we might think about for leveraging the significant resources that your treasurer's office has, and I know that ours does too, to try to advance these shared goals that we have, and how you can leverage that to pull in more private capital into this effort.
Thanks for the question. from a resource perspective, the thing that we found to be most effective is the state reaching out to those pools of capital and saying, what is it that they need to make that deal work? In the case of the AFL-CIO's Housing Investment Trust, excuse me, that was Nevada moving into a second position, which allowed them to then lever their dollars a little bit more effectively, right? So we were able to take on a bit more risk because our investment profile there is simply getting the additional housing and not losing money, right? But our desire to make money there is less significant than sort of the private markets. That's been effective. The moving of money outside of the general fund into additional buckets that are able to invest directly in housing. In Nevada, we have a constitutional prohibition against directly investing in businesses. We're not able to do it, right? I can't buy equities. And so because of that, right, we have to find ways where we can be supportive on the fixed income side. But most of our success there, Representative, has been asking the capital what they need and then finding ways that we can do it within the relatively rigorous framework that we've got. I find generally there are not a lot of people in the affordable housing space who are willing to put their money in first and take their money out last. I think that's a role that the state can have because our interests here, like I said, aren't completely on the financial side. Our interests are making sure that we can build as much housing as possible for Nevadans.
Thank you. No, and there's been a lot of conversation about kind of the private developers, private marketplace. Do you have any experience in working with your public housing authority system, which I think has been an underutilized resource, maybe nationally, but I think here in Connecticut? And I wonder, are there any opportunities, or have you identified any opportunities to work with public housing authorities?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we have 3 regional public housing authorities. The one in Southern Nevada and Las Vegas has been a little under the weather for a while, but it's started to get kind of back into the swing of things. The local housing authorities generally take a portion of the state's allocation of private activity bonds and help to direct it. So the state is doing some work in that space. The locals are doing some work in that space. And we try to dovetail those 2 things together as effectively as possible. We found that the locals are the better vehicles to lean in on things like zoning and make sure that the zoning practices, which they're dealing with every day from mechanically, as opposed to just sort of the conceptual way we deal with it, to make sure that those are happening.
I'm intrigued by your reference to a regional housing authority. How can you expand on that a little bit? We don't have that here. We don't even have county level government at all. So we have the state government and then local government and nothing really in between. We have a couple of regional entities that exist and we should utilize more, but we don't, given our kind of political psychology here in Connecticut about doing everything at the micro level. So I'd be intrigued to hear how your regional public housing authorities actually work and what is their function. So it sounds like you have a regional one and then there are below those, there are the local ones as well.
Yeah, so in Nevada, 17 counties, a majority of people live within Clark County, which is in Southern Nevada, which is where Las Vegas is. That's about 2 and change million of the people. And they have the Southern Nevada Regional Housing Authority. There are housing efforts that take place within the city of Las Vegas or the city of Henderson or the city of North Las Vegas. But the Regional Housing Authority, when it's working in the way it should, is coordinating those efforts, right? Making sure that we don't get into jurisdictional disputes. One of the problems that we've run into with affordable housing and with any other sort of thing, and I suspect this is not a Nevada specific problem, is that there will be a developer who could build on, say, one side of a border between a city and another side of a border between a city, and will, as is their prerogative, play off the 2 cities to try and get the better outcome. And so a regional housing authority, when they're leaning in, effectively can help coordinate and avoid some of those sort of unnecessary frictions. And generally those frictions just end up making the housing cost more per unit as opposed to actually building a better product. So the regional housing authorities have been effective in that work. The rest of the state, we have a Reno Housing Authority, RENO, Reno Housing Authority, which is Washoe County, the other large county in the state. And then the rest of the other 15 counties are combined into a rural housing authority. The rural housing authority has been interesting because it provides some level of purchasing power and decision power to those counties. Each of those counties, their allocation, which is based on population, of private activity bonds is too small to actually build a project, right? We're talking $3 million in one, $2 million in another, $800,000 in a third. But by combining those all together, the Rural Housing Authority is able to help support projects, that we know we're not going to have a project in every one of the 15 counties every year. It just mathematically wouldn't work, right? You'd be building one apartment that's freestanding. But if we're able to sort of use that as a central clearinghouse, we're able to move those dollars around between counties and build the project that is actually the highest and best for the area. And I think the housing, specifically the Rural Housing Authority, does an exceptional job of kind of keeping everybody rowing in the same direction, which can be difficult.
Got it. I know we have one question online. I'll ask one more and then allow some other folks to ask questions. On the infrastructure bank, again, if you could expand a little bit on that, on what are the investments that are made by that infrastructure bank? And I don't know if it's completely capitalized with ARPA dollars, which will disappear at some point, but if you could speak about how that's capitalized, I think that would be helpful too.
Excellent. Yeah. So the infrastructure bank was completely capitalized through a general obligation bond issued by the state. So no ARPA dollars in there at all. So we've got a corpus of about $75 million. We split that $75 million into three tranches. $15 million for educational support, primarily a charter school revolving loan capital fund, which is a long political story, but an effective vehicle.
It would be here too.
Yeah, we were able to take that $15 million and leverage it with about $85 million of outside capital, creating a $100 million fund, right? Which has really been sort of the for what reason of the infrastructure bank is to A, complete projects that we couldn't complete but for the infrastructure bank, but B, have a vehicle where outside capital can come into the state, which was not something that we saw a lot of, right? There wasn't a lot of public-private partnerships coming in Nevada, and the infrastructure bank by its nature sort of creates them. Second piece was the housing dollars that I spoke to, about $20 million that is levered against around $200 million from the AFL-CIO's Housing Investment Trust, again, which is a mutual fund, does this work everywhere. And same thing, right? By creating that $20 million and positioning it behind this additional money, we're able to drive that capital into the state and those developers. And then the last chunk for us was within the infrastructure investment and jobs law. There are plenty of things where the state would need to come up with some piece of match. In Nevada, because of our 2-year budget cycle and the small amount of time we're in session, we often miss out on federal dollars because we don't have a mechanic to quickly find the money for the match, right? We might have the cash, but we don't have the legislative authority. And so the bank gives us the opportunity to avoid that as a problem with sort of a blanket, you can spend money on this if you need to. There are absolute benefits in that. Obviously, there's the detriment of not having that sort of public feedback every time we do it, but we run the bank as a public entity, which has, subject to open meeting law and public meetings and things like that. And so we feel like we give a pretty good job of getting feedback from the public, certainly not the kind of feedback that you get in the legislative process.
I know. One last question on the infrastructure bank. What's your governance system? Who governs the bank itself? Is it internally operated, or do you have external partners who help you make decisions?
Yeah, so the bank currently is governed by a board of directors, of which I am the chair. Our staff in the Treasury provides support to the bank. We're able to bring in outside help, and we do for things like our bond issuance, and financial advisors and things like that. But the decision making happens through a board.
And I totally lied about being my last question. When I think of infrastructure, a lot of the conversation we have here is about sewer and water. That's not something that's contemplated under your infrastructure bank?
We can, but what we found was that, sewer and water projects, assuming that they are existing, can be handled under the revolving water funds that exist within the state of Nevada and many other states, right? Those can be WIFIA dollars. Transportation projects we can pay for using our Nevada Department of Transportation dollars and the Transportation Trust Fund writ large, right? There's plenty of money out there to do that work. What we found is that there wasn't a lot of money out there to do innovative things on affordable housing. There wasn't a lot of money out there to do innovative things on charter schools. So we really try to use the bank to fill in the gaps around the financing structure. Now, with that said, there are sewer and water projects that are for expansion as opposed to revision of existing capacity, and most revolving water funds can't support those. And so the bank can go in and provide short-term capital or long-term capital to build out, let's say, a new sewer treatment plant for an expanded housing subdivision. We can do that work. We haven't done a lot of it yet, but we expect we'll do more in the future.
Oh, got it. Thank you so much. We're going to go to Senator Duff, and then we have Francis Pickering online. He's the executive director of one of those regional entities that we don't utilize quite enough. Senator Duff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks again, Treasurer, for a great presentation and a lot of good information on how it impacts you in your state. I wanted to ask, you touched upon a little bit about local zoning and how that, especially since you have county government, and how that works with your infrastructure bank and even building more housing. I mean, in Connecticut, we have over 100,000 job openings. We probably are over 100,000 units short of where we need to be on housing, and a good chunk of that is obviously in affordable housing as well. But trying to, how well or not, or what's the tension, I guess, between what you're trying to do and local government or county government as it relates to building housing or zoning resistance?
Thanks for the question, Senator. I'm trying to figure out the nice way to say this. We generally do not spend a ton of time thinking about zoning because the size of the whole is so big. And so we direct capital to places where zoning isn't an issue. And so there are certain communities that are more willing to allow for infill housing. They get more of the money. They get more of the attention. And when we're working in communities that have less of an interest in that front, we encourage them to realize that the reason why they haven't necessarily gotten as much money as other communities have had is because the zoning is an issue. I'll say that broadly, with the exception of some NIMBYism, which is bound to happen literally anywhere, we don't have that much of a problem on getting the local governments to be in line. They recognize the problem is as significant as we recognize the problem is. They are focused in the same way. They generally are oriented in the same direction. But we do think there's a value in the state or any other sort of capital allocation partner saying, hey, these are our values, and we're going to move those capital dollars around as befitting of the folks who share those values. And so we've seen ideas and plans for either restrictions at the legislative level that say, if you want access to this pool of money, here are the things you need to do. You need to have a fast lane for affordable housing construction. You need to reduce connection fees on sewer and water or various other things that can be barriers to affordable housing. We support those sorts of efforts broadly. But as of today, there has been enough need that we haven't found ourselves sort of in a tiff with the local governments on zoning. Another, I guess I should mention, another quality for Nevada is about 80% of our land is still owned by the federal government. And so oftentimes the folks that we're working with to try and get access to land isn't Nevadans at all, it's the BLM. Oh,
that's interesting. Okay. I would say that it's a little different here in Connecticut with regards to local zoning and the tensions that are faced. And I think Connecticut is a bit at a crossroads right now as to whether or not we continue kind of beating our head against the wall on working with some of the smaller communities, or we just invest in other communities that want to grow and thrive and build more housing and have more housing. Because if it's easier to build it there, then maybe that's what we do. But the lack of housing, as probably in your state, is holding us back economically, and we've got to figure out ways in which we can have successes rather than just continue to argue the same old topics year after year. One other thing you mentioned was expiring affordable housing units. Can you just expand on that a little bit so we can have a little bit more information? Yes.
So thanks for the question, Senator, and couldn't agree more on the importance of all of that. But on the expiration of housing, generally, when a developer agrees for their housing to become affordable, two things happen. They get access to capital they wouldn't have access to otherwise, and their rent what they can charge for the apartments is controlled, right, by a calculation. That calculation generally is room to room. They're starting to make changes around the country. HUD is, so that you'll be able to look at the entire project and look at the average there, which would be much more helpful for developers. That gets a little bit in the weeds, but happy to chat about it if anyone wants. But you're restricting those units. You're saying we're only going to rent to individuals who have 60% of average median income or less, right? You can have units at 50%, you can have units at 20%, 30%, whatever you want. But generally, you see projects being built that are majority of them are 60%. The incremental benefit to the developer of having units that are more restricted generally is not outweighed by the amount of capital that comes in. 60% generally is the sweet spot for what we call big A affordable housing. Once a project is completed, it is restricted from moving outside of that affordability for a period of time. In Nevada, new projects are 30 years. So if you build a project on day one, 30 years later, that developer is no longer controlled by the restrictions around income. Older projects had that same restriction, but the time frame is often less, as little as 15 years. Some were done at 12 years, but most of them in Nevada are 15-year pieces of business. Because that was all done by different folks, right? There was a different treasurer at that point. There were different people working in housing. There's been basically full turnover in those agencies around the state. We didn't have any institutional memory that said, here are projects that were done that were big A affordable, who at some point won't be big A affordable. We didn't have a database. And so when those projects are moving off of affordability, when they get to year 16 or 31 or whatever it is for that specific project, the developer has a choice. The owner has a choice. They can either move that project to market rate, assuming they're going to continue to use it as housing, right? But they can keep it they can move it into market rate housing, right? Which is generally a pretty significant increase in rent over what it was, right? Or they can go through a process called acquisition rehab or AC rehab, where they will get in additional dollars, right? As though they were buying the project new. They will get additional dollars for renovations, which can be really useful. A lot of these units are, at this case, or at this stage, 15, 20 years old. There is not a ton of incentive for affordable housing developers to continue to update the properties each and every year, just like any other housing developer, right? There's kind of a fine line between profit and not. And so those units often are a little bit long in the tooth. And so those new dollars both keep them affordable and help bring up the quality of life for the individuals who are in those units. And then the clock starts over. So Nevada, right, if we have something that's been affordable for 15 years and it's about to expire, and we can convince them to keep that unit affordable, which generally they're amenable to because they're already in the business of affordable housing, right? You don't have a lot of one-off affordable housing developers where they have one unit, right, or one building. It's usually multiple because this thing scales effectively. We're able to keep it affordable in the future for another 30 years, right? So the timer starts over, they get some additional money, there's an additional, there's state support and tax credit support and the rest. They're able to revitalize the property and keep it affordable for another 15, 20, 30 years. By definition, those units are much cheaper per unit than the creation of new housing. It depends on the age of the unit and the rest, but think about it in the term of about 5 to 7-fold cheaper to keep a unit affordable than it is to create a new affordable unit. And that could be massive, right? Massive. And each one of those units sort of counts, right? If you lose a unit at the top or you gain a unit at the bottom, it's the same unit when we look at our overall stats and the overall need in the state. So we spend a lot of time making sure that we don't have affordable housing fall out of affordability. And I expect Connecticut and in almost every other state, you have units that are falling out of affordability every month, right? And every one of those having to rebuild from the ground is much more expensive.
Right, thank you. And we're experiencing the same issue here in Connecticut, and having your thoughts on that is very much appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. He just went to refill his coffee. He'll be back in 2 seconds. No, I'm kidding. I'm making that up. Francis Pickering, can you hear me? Oh, there you go.
Yeah, yes. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. A couple of questions with the interesting financing mechanism you use, the infrastructure bank and private activity bonds and so on and so forth. How much of that is, I guess I could say, benefited by Nevada being a boom state, right? If you didn't have the large in-migration and the boom we've seen in Nevada, would those financing mechanisms work?
It's a great question, sir. So in Nevada, right, the two big mechanisms that we're using, the infrastructure bank has really no population locus. Functionally, obviously, additional people in the state theoretically generate sales tax. That sales tax can, and property tax and the rest could theoretically support more general obligation bonds of the state, but not mechanically, right? So no on that front. On the additional population coming in on private activity bonds, which are doled out by the federal government, are a product of population, right? So there's a base level of private activity bonds that every state gets, and then as your population increases, you get additional dollars. And so the state of Nevada gets around $350 million worth of private activity bonds on an annual basis. We were about 5 to 7 years ago, we were under the cap where you start getting additional dollars from the feds, and so we've gone over that. So population helps us there. I would argue, we would rather 1 unit of housing, which is needed for 1 new person moving into the state, is certainly not paid for by the increase in private activity bonds, right? There's no correlation there. It's a 100 to 1, right? But yes, we do get additional sort of dollars from that front. The rest of the capital doesn't, we haven't really seen any interest or change, or even that it factors into, right? The strength of Nevada economically is certainly bolstered by people wanting to move in, right? That's helpful to us. It helps us fill jobs and the rest. But we haven't seen that translate into additional financial support for housing.
Thank you. And then on the expiration of existing affordable housing units, when you pull those units or keep them in the program, pull them back into the program, is that just done with a cash infusion, or do you also use tax credits?
Almost completely tax credits. So in most cases, acquisition rehab is supported by private activity bond dollars, right? So we're using conduit issuance. We're giving that developer access to issue tax-exempt bonding. That tax-exempt bonding makes the math work for them, right? So a combination of that, LIHTC, and other tax credits. But the state is very rarely putting cash dollars into those projects, with the exception of the Home Means Nevada initiative, which was that $500 million worth of ARPA, kind of a one-time product. And what we found, again, with those dollars is some of that moved projects from 2027 into 2023. Or 2024, there was some of that, but a majority of that was effectively covering the inflationary pressures so that the units that were going to get built prior to, lumber tripling in price temporarily, right? Those units could still get built with the same economics to the developer or similar economics to the developer that they had going in, right? But outside of that, we haven't seen a ton of direct cash infusion into those types of entities.
Interesting. And then one last question on the AFL-CIO arrangement you mentioned, and the use of union construction workforce. Do you have an adequate supply of construction workers, especially union construction workers, to build all of this? And if not, how are you addressing that?
Great question. So one, they help find their own workforce, right? So unlike other construction projects where you might have a contractor going out and trying to find the people who they need to do the work, the AFL-CIO, by its definition, knows where those workers are and has the mechanics to hire those workers on, right? So they're able to work with the locals and say, okay, we don't have enough people in this trade, let's move them from another state, right? So that's actually been very helpful from a workforce perspective. Nevada is a pretty strong labor state. Most of the Las Vegas Strip is both powered by and built by signatory contractors and in union labor. And so we don't have that sort of an issue as much. What we have found is that if there are non-union contractors, they might have a little bit more trouble finding labor than they did because all of the union contractors and labor is being kind of sucked up into those entities. But we haven't found that to be a problem. Now, with that said, in our more rural communities, right, we have the ability to work outside of those project labor agreements because we don't have, for instance, the union contracted work there. The board recently approved, not housing related, but recently approved a fire station. We're providing some gap financing for a fire station in a place called West Wendover, which is on the Utah border on the northeast side of the state. There are not enough union contractors in that area to do that work. There aren't enough contractors to do that work. And so we're going to be bringing people from all over the place. And so we wanted to make sure as we created that vehicle that we had enough flexibility sort of to start from a place of here's how we'd like to build it. Here's what we think is most effective for the broad universe of what we're trying to get done. But to give ourselves some safety and relief valves in case something became improbable.
All right, those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see Brian O'Connor from the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities.
Thank you, and thank you, Treasurer Conine. It was a great presentation. I just have a couple questions regarding, the private activity bonds and the infrastructure bank. Now, do you ever have municipalities? I understand it's probably nonprofit developers and also for-profit, but do you ever have, let's say, a public housing authority or an entity like that apply as well?
Absolutely. And so the regional housing authorities function as public housing authorities, right? So the Southern Nevada Housing Authority does operate and develop affordable housing. Reno Housing Authority does occasionally, and the Rural Housing Authority does very infrequently. But in Southern Nevada, the entities are one and the same.
Okay. And who administers it? Is it your office or is it your Department of Housing as far as, either that or the multi-unit dwelling applications and also the down payment assistance?
Yep. So the triage for all of that is done by our housing department, who does a wonderful job. Very, very small department, but they do a really good job. So our housing department, which is part of business and industry, which is effectively our commerce department, functions in that role. And then our office, myself and the governor and the controller, who is our state's chief accountant, and a few others sit on something called the Board of Finance, which does the final approval. We also have an advisory council, which is legislatively led and has some members of private industry who are serve an advisory role as to the kind of allocation of those credits originally. But broadly, $350 million comes in, that it gets split. The state keeps 175, the counties take 175 in proportion to their size. The smaller counties pool their private activity bond funding into the Rural Housing Authority. The Rural Housing Authority generally then partners with the state to do projects in the rurals. Clark County, which receives the lion's share of the county portion of those dollars, will work with North Las Vegas, City of Las Vegas, City of Henderson, and the other unincorporated parts of the county. And they will do projects themselves, and they'll do projects in partnership with the state.
Great. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Thank you, Brian. Any other folks have questions or comments for Treasurer Conine from Nevada? No, not seeing any others. So thank you so much for joining us from sunny Chicago. Senator Duff, I don't know if you have any closing comments for your colleague.
No, I just want to thank you, Treasurer, for all your expertise. We appreciate it. And a shout out to Speaker Yeager and Senator Dondero Loop, who are good friends as well. And we appreciate the partnership here with Nevada and all of its legislators and Treasurer and everyone else I think we're all trying to do the same thing as public policy folks and ensure that we have housing for folks across our country. So thank you for being here. Thanks for your time and your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me. And of course, if we can be of service, don't hesitate to reach out. We're big fans of Connecticut.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for that participating in that conversation. The only other item we want to, if you feel inspired to, feel free
Well,
to.
I wanted to comment a little bit on the volume cap questions that have come up, and they're interesting because I think every state is positioned so differently from a private activity volume cap perspective, and I think that, you know, I don't know how Nevada does it, but home ownership is a huge goal in terms of trying to make sure that first-time home buyers have access to the availability of down payment assistance, but also an affordable first mortgage. And so private activity volume cap is actually most often used to enable first-time home ownership in many states. In addition to that, I think the whole AC rehab point was well made, and I think that's something that Connecticut is focused on making sure happens. And you know, CHFA along with DOH have focused a lot in the last few years, especially as deals are coming up against their expiration dates, to make sure that those units are getting preserved. Often the tax credit is necessary because of the scale of development as well as the acquisition dollars that are needed to transfer ownership. But there can be a tension between needing the private activity volume cap to create new units versus preserving units that are coming up against their expiration deadline. So I guess my only point there was just to say that I very much understand the need for a private activity volume cap to be used, you know, for its highest and best uses, and often there's significant tension between all of its various uses. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments, any folks online? All right, for our next item, what we want to talk about was just the process for the subcommittees who are all kind of wrapping up their work and developing their recommendations. I think some of the subcommittees are taking different approaches to it. The barrier subgroup that I've been leading we're about to send our draft recommendations out to the committee, kind of take an informal vote to try to prioritize some of the recommendations that we think might be most feasible in a short legislative session and in the second year of a budget, recognizing that there's probably lots of good ideas out there, but many of them might cost money. And it's not that we can't consider them, but we know that there are likely to be limitations in terms of what we can spend new dollars on in the short session. But that doesn't preclude us from looking ahead to the next legislative session when we enter budget discussions again. So I know the committees are in different places with their recommendations, but we'd ask for folks to wrap that process up in the next week. The legislation called for a report to be presented to the Housing Committee. We know that there's likely to be recommendations in that report that are not the purview of the Housing Committee. So those of us who kind of serve in the elected part of this will figure out the logistics of getting recommendations that we see as feasible as being able to be done this legislative session. We know that we think there'll be a kind of a catch-all bill for recommendations from the roundtable itself, so that it has its own vehicle. But we also don't want to put in a gazillion different concepts into one bill and try to get that through the process, knowing that a bill like that might have to go to 7 or 8 committees, depending on what's included in that bill. So as the subcommittees are just wrapping up their work, we can send those into the staff. We will aggregate all of that information, then get it back out to the working group, and I think we'll make determinations about whether that's something we just want to move forward to the committee, or if there's interest in taking a vote, we can take a vote, or also present an opportunity for any members of the roundtable to offer their dissent if they don't necessarily agree with a recommendation either. We all know as part of this process, just because you might vote to move something forward doesn't necessarily mean that you fully endorse the concept for final passage as a law. So we'll kind of work through those logistics, but certainly be able to present to the legislature some more recommendations that we can all consider as we try to advance this policy goal of housing, knowing that none of this is going to be done in 1 year. It'll be a multi-year effort. So, Senator Duff, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I appreciate that. Thank you, and thanks to the members of the roundtable for all their work and help on this. I think one of the goals was to continue the conversation in the interim between the long session and the short session. I think we've been successful at doing that. I think we've opened up a lot of dialogue. And thanks to many articles in the media as well, that's helped to inform the public about what we've been doing and try and help to let them know, the public, about some of the challenges we face on housing and building housing here in the state of Connecticut. So for us, I think we will, as the majority leader said, we will work to bring all those things together and have pieces and multiple bills. But we'll also probably still work to keep the roundtable moving forward. I expect to meet at some point during the session. Not going to say how many times, because who knows, because we all get busy during the session. But it is something that we want to continue, because this is really one of the most important issues, if not the most important issue facing our state right now. So we need to continue this conversation and work with partners in our communities, work with our state agencies who are here, and continue to figure out strategies so that we can get shovels in the ground and have success. So I just want to thank the House Majority Leader for all his work and his effort on this, and our staffs for what they've done, and look forward to coming back hopefully in a couple weeks. I think we have one other thing that's going to be really interesting and informative, and we'll send that information out as soon as we have things confirmed. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think that is it for today's meeting. So everybody gets a half hour back to work on housing issues, and we will be in touch about our next meeting. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
This video is a public service of CT 169 Strong, a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to preserving neighborhoods. To learn more and donate, please visit us at ct169strong.org.